Inside Texas Death Row Transfers. The secret operations behind America's deadliest system. If you think you've seen darkness, you haven't been to Polunsky Unit at 3 a.m., smash that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me which death row case haunts you the most, and hit the notification bell. Because what you're about to witness will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. The white transport van pulled through the gates of the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, just as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Inside sat a man the state had been trying to kill for 17 years. His name was Vincent the Prophet Castellano, and he'd just become the most valuable prisoner in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, though nobody except a select few knew why. Vincent wasn't supposed to be on this van. According to official records, he was scheduled for transfer to the Walls Unit in Huntsville in 3 days for his execution date. But at 2:15 that morning, 6 correctional officers in unmarked uniforms had entered his cell, shackled him in ways that made movement nearly impossible, and loaded him into a van with blacked-out windows and no identification markings. No paperwork. No official transfer orders. No witnesses except the guards who'd been paid extra to forget they'd ever seen Vincent Castellano that night. The van's interior smelled like fear and diesel fuel. Vincent sat perfectly still, his mind calculating angles, processing information, trying to understand what was happening. He'd spent 17 years on death row, 17 years watching men walk past his cell toward execution chambers they'd never return from, 17 years becoming an expert on the machinery of state-sanctioned death. And in all that time, he'd never heard of a transfer like this. Secret, urgent, terrifyingly off the books. The guard sitting across from him, a massive man with a scar running down his left cheek, finally spoke. "You know why you're here, Castellano?" Vincent's voice was steady, betraying none of the fear coursing through his veins. "I know I'm supposed to be executed in 72 hours. I know this transfer isn't official. And I know that when the state starts breaking its own rules, someone's about to die off the record." The guard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Smart man. That's why they pick you. You see patterns other people miss. You understand how systems work, how power flows, how secrets get buried." He leaned forward, chains rattling. "How much do you know about the Texas death row transfer system?" "Enough to know it doesn't work like this." "It doesn't. Usually. But 3 weeks ago, something happened that changed the game. A death row inmate named Robert Keyes was transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville for execution. Routine transfer, completely by the book. Except Keyes never made it to Huntsville. The van disappeared for 47 minutes. When it arrived at the Walls Unit, Keyes was dead. Heart attack, according to the medical examiner. Natural causes. Case closed. Vincent's mind raced. Except it wasn't natural causes. Except it wasn't natural causes, the guard confirmed. Keyes was murdered during that 47-minute gap. And the reason nobody's investigating is because whoever killed him has enough power to make correctional officers, medical examiners, and state officials look the other way. The van hit a pothole, and Vincent's shackles bit into his wrists. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because 2 days after Keyes died, another death row inmate was transferred. Marcus Webb. Same thing. Van disappeared for 38 minutes. Webb arrived dead. Natural causes. And yesterday, a third, Daniel Cross. 52 minutes unaccounted for. DOA. And in 72 hours, you're scheduled for the same route." Vincent felt his blood run cold. Someone's killing death row inmates during transfers and making it look natural. Not just someone. Someone with access to transfer schedules, someone who can coordinate with guards and medical staff, someone who benefits from these specific inmates dying before they reach the execution chamber. Because here's the thing, Castellano. Keyes, Webb, and Cross all had one thing in common. They were all scheduled to give final interviews before execution. Interviews where they planned to reveal information about their cases, about corruption, about people in power who put them on death row to silence them. The van turned sharply, and Vincent glimpsed through the small window the silhouette of buildings he didn't recognize. They weren't heading to any prison he knew. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. Somewhere off the grid. Because you, Vincent Castellano, are the only death row inmate with the intelligence and the credibility to expose what's really happening. You're a former federal prosecutor who got framed for a murder you didn't commit. You spent 17 years investigating your own case from inside a cell, uncovering evidence of judicial corruption that goes all the way to the governor's office. And in 3 days, you were supposed to do a final interview with a national news network where you'd reveal everything. Vincent understood immediately. They were going to kill me during the transfer. Make it look natural. Bury my evidence along with my body. Exactly. Except there's a problem. There are people inside the system who don't want that to happen. People who believe your story, who've seen the evidence you've compiled, who think maybe, just maybe, Texas has been executing innocent men to cover up crimes committed by people who are supposed to represent justice. The guard reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside here is everything we've collected on the death row transfer murders. Autopsy reports that don't match the official findings. Cell phone records showing communication between guards and unknown numbers during the exact times the vans went dark. Financial records showing payments to correctional officers from shell companies. And a list of 12 more death row inmates scheduled for transfer in the next 6 months. 12 more men who might be murdered before they can tell their stories. Vincent took the envelope with shackled hands, his mind already analyzing, processing, building the case. Why me? Why not go to the media yourselves? Because we're correctional officers. We're part of the system. Anything we say gets dismissed as disgruntled employees or conspiracy theorists. But you're Vincent, the Prophet Castellano, former prosecutor, death row inmate with 17 years of legal expertise. If you expose this, if you can prove that Texas is murdering its own prisoners to cover up corruption, it brings down the entire house of cards. The van stopped. Vincent could hear voices outside, urgent and tense. The guard's expression shifted from determined to worried. We're here, and I need you to listen very carefully. In about 30 seconds, that door is going to open, and you're going to see something that will make you understand just how deep this goes. What am I going to see? The guard's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The man who's been ordering the death row murders. The man who has the power to make inmates disappear, evidence vanish, and witnesses die. The man who put you on death row 17 years ago to silence what you discovered about his operation. Vincent's heart pounded. Who? The van door opened, flooding the interior with harsh fluorescent light. And standing there, silhouetted against the brightness, was a face Vincent hadn't seen in 17 years. A face that had haunted his nightmares, that represented everything corrupt about the system he'd once believed in. Judge Raymond Blackstone. The man who'd presided over Vincent's trial. The man who'd sentenced him to death despite evidence of his innocence. The man who, according to the envelope Vincent now held, had been systematically eliminating anyone who could expose his connection to organized crime, judicial corruption, and murders that spanned 2 decades. Judge Blackstone smiled, and it was the smile of a man who knew he'd already won. Hello, Vincent. I've been waiting a long time for this conversation. Because, you see, you're not here to expose me. You're here because I'm going to offer you something no death row inmate has ever been offered before. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than a shout. Your freedom. In exchange for your silence. Choose wisely. You have exactly 60 seconds. And as Vincent stared into the eyes of the man who destroyed his life, he realized that the next minute would determine not just his fate, but the fate of 12 other condemned men, and possibly reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Texas government. The clock was ticking, and Vincent Castellano, the man they called the Prophet because he saw patterns others missed, had to make the most important decision of his life. With his hands still shackled, holding evidence that could bring down a judge, surrounded by guards who might be allies or enemies, Vincent opened his mouth to speak. But before he could say a word, gunshots exploded through the warehouse, and everything went dark. The gunfire lasted exactly 7 seconds, but in that moment, Vincent's world compressed into pure survival instinct. He threw himself sideways as bullets tore through the van's metal exterior, sparks flying in the darkness. The guard with the scarred face grabbed Vincent's shackles and yanked him down behind the vehicle's chassis, their only cover as chaos erupted around them. Judge Blackstone had vanished the instant the shooting started, disappearing into shadows with the practiced ease of someone who'd planned for this exact scenario. The other guards scattered, some returning fire toward unseen attackers, others running for cover behind industrial equipment that littered the warehouse floor. When the shooting stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise. Vincent's ears rang, his heart hammered against his ribs, and the metallic taste of adrenaline flooded his mouth. The scarred guard was checking his weapon, his face grim in the dim emergency lighting that had kicked on automatically. "That wasn't supposed to happen," the guard muttered, more to himself than to Vincent. "Someone knew we'd be here. Someone leaked our location." Vincent's prosecutor mind kicked into gear despite the circumstances. Which means someone on your team is compromised. Or your entire operation is a setup. He rattled his shackles. "Either way, I'm a sitting duck like this. If you want me alive, you need to get these off." The guard hesitated, years of training warring with the reality of their situation. Finally, he pulled out a key and unlocked Vincent's restraints. "You run, and I'll hunt you down myself. You stay, and maybe we both survive long enough to figure out who just tried to kill us." "Us." Vincent rubbed his wrists, blood flowing back into his hands. "Those bullets were meant for me. You're just collateral damage. Maybe. Or maybe whoever's out there doesn't want any witnesses to what Judge Blackstone just offered you. Think about it, Castellano. Why would Blackstone personally show up to make you a deal? Why not send intermediaries, maintain deniability? Unless he was never planning to let you walk out of here alive, regardless of your answer." Vincent's mind raced through the implications. The guard was right. Blackstone's appearance made no tactical sense unless the judge had planned to eliminate Vincent regardless of his choice. Which meant the envelope, the evidence, the offer of freedom. All of it might have been theater leading to Vincent's execution. But then why the gunfire? Why attack now, before Blackstone could finish his play? Unless there were three sides to this game, not two. A voice echoed through the warehouse, amplified by a megaphone. "Vincent Castellano, we know you're in there. We know what you're carrying. Walk out with your hands up, and we'll talk. Stay hidden, and we'll burn this building down with everyone inside." Vincent and the guard exchanged glances. The voice didn't belong to police or federal agents. It was too cold, too confident, too comfortable with making threats that law enforcement would never voice out loud. "Who the hell is that?" Vincent whispered. "I don't know. But they're not supposed to be here. This location was chosen because it's owned by a shell company we control. No one outside our operation should know about it." Vincent crawled to the edge of their cover and risked a look around the van. The warehouse was massive, probably an old manufacturing facility, with rusted equipment creating shadows within shadows. He counted at least 6 armed figures moving in tactical formation, professionals who knew how to clear a building. They wore no uniforms, no identifying marks, just black tactical gear and weapons that looked military grade. And in the center of the warehouse floor, hands zip-tied behind his back and forced to his knees, was Judge Raymond Blackstone. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, and his expensive suit was torn. But what caught Vincent's attention was the expression on Blackstone's face. Not fear, not anger, something closer to resignation, like a man who'd been caught in a trap he'd spent years trying to avoid. The voice with the megaphone spoke again. "Castellano, I'm going to make this very simple. Judge Blackstone has been operating a death row murder scheme for 6 years. He's eliminated 17 inmates who threatened to expose his criminal network. But what Blackstone didn't know is that he's been working for us the entire time. Every murder he ordered, every guard he corrupted, every piece of evidence he buried. It was all data we collected. And now that collection is complete." Vincent felt his stomach drop. This wasn't about justice or corruption or exposing the truth. This was about one criminal organization using the justice system as a weapon against another. Here's the deal, Castellano. You're carrying evidence that implicates Blackstone in multiple murders. Evidence that would send him to the same death row he's been using as his personal execution chamber. We want that evidence. Not to expose him. We want to continue using him. But we need leverage, insurance, something to make sure he understands who really controls this operation. You give us that envelope, you walk away free. You keep it, and everyone in this warehouse dies. Starting with you. The scarred guard grabbed Vincent's arm. Don't do it. That evidence is the only thing keeping you alive. You give it to them, they'll kill you anyway to tie up loose ends. And if I don't, they kill everyone here and take it off my corpse, Vincent shot back. Either way, I'm dead. At least this way, maybe some of you survive. But Vincent's mind was already working 3 moves ahead, the way it had during his years as a prosecutor, the way it had during 17 years on death row analyzing his own case. He'd read enough of the envelope's contents during the van ride to understand its value. Autopsy reports, financial records, communication logs. It was a complete prosecution package. Everything needed to dismantle Blackstone's operation and potentially expose everyone involved. But there was something else in that envelope. Something the guard probably didn't know about. Something that Vincent had spotted in those few minutes of reading. A pattern in the timing of the transfers. A correlation between specific death row inmates and specific dates. A mathematical precision that suggested the murders weren't just about silencing witnesses. They were about something bigger. Something that required specific people to die on specific days for a reason Vincent hadn't fully unraveled yet. I need more time, Vincent called out to the darkness. You want this evidence? First tell me who you are and what you're really after. Because I've seen what's in this envelope, and dead inmates are just the symptom. What's the disease? A figure stepped into the light, lowering the megaphone. He was younger than Vincent expected, maybe 40, with the kind of face that disappeared in crowds and cold eyes that had seen too much death. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that Judge Blackstone has been running death row like his personal hit list, and he's been doing it with funding and protection from people who make his judicial power look like a children's game. We're the cleanup crew, Castellano. We eliminate problems before they become public scandals. And right now you're a problem. Because I know what you don't, Vincent said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I know why the timing matters. I know why specific inmates had to die on specific dates. And I know what happens in 3 weeks if someone doesn't stop it. The young man's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his professional facade. You're bluffing. Am I? Then why did Robert Keyes have to die exactly 17 days before the state legislature voted on criminal justice reform? Why did Marcus Webb have to die 48 hours before a federal audit of Texas corrections facilities? Why did Daniel Cross have to die the same day a documentary crew was scheduled to interview death row inmates about their cases? Vincent stood up slowly, the envelope held in front of him like a shield. These weren't random murders to silence witnesses. They were timed executions designed to influence events, to manipulate political processes, to control outcomes. And Judge Blackstone wasn't just eliminating threats. He was following orders from someone who's using death row as a tool to manipulate Texas politics from the shadows. The warehouse had gone completely silent. Even the armed figures had stopped moving, their attention locked on Vincent's words. That's why you're really here, Vincent continued, his prosecutor instincts fully engaged now. Not to retrieve evidence. Not to protect Blackstone. You're here because someone realized I'd figured out the pattern. And patterns are the one thing criminal conspiracies can't survive. You kill me. You stop the pattern from being exposed. But you don't stop me from having already shared what I know. It was a bluff. Vincent hadn't shared anything with anyone. But his 17 years on death row had taught him that the most powerful weapon wasn't truth. It was the fear of truth, the uncertainty of what information might already be loose in the world. The young man raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Vincent's chest. Last chance, Castellano. The envelope. Now. Or what? You shoot me, And you never know who else has seen what I've seen? You burn this warehouse, and you guarantee that someone somewhere will ask questions about why a death row inmate disappeared the same night a warehouse mysteriously caught fire. Vincent took a step forward, knowing he was either about to save his life or end it. Here's my counteroffer. I keep the envelope. I walk out of here. And in exchange, I don't tell anyone about the pattern I discovered. Because if that pattern becomes public, it doesn't just bring down Blackstone. It brings down everyone involved in this operation, including whoever you're really working for. And something tells me your employers value their anonymity more than they value one dead prosecutor. The young man's finger tightened on the trigger. For a long, terrible moment, Vincent thought he'd miscalculated, that his bluff was about to get him killed. Then the young man lowered his weapon. You've got 48 hours, Castellano. After that, we consider you a liability and act accordingly. 48 hours to disappear so completely that even we can't find you. Because if we can find you, others can too. And trust me, we're not the only ones who want that envelope. He gestured to his team, and they began withdrawing, moving with the same tactical precision they'd entered with. Within 60 seconds, the warehouse was empty except for Vincent, the SCAR guard, 2 other guards who'd survived the firefight, and Judge Raymond Blackstone, still kneeling on the concrete floor, blood dripping from his face. Vincent walked over to Blackstone, the envelope still clutched in his hand. The judge looked up, and for the first time, Vincent saw something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. You always were the smartest one in the courtroom, Blackstone said quietly. That's why I had to put you on death row. You were 3 months away from uncovering my entire operation when I framed you for that murder. And even on death row, even facing execution, you never stopped investigating. You just shifted targets from your own case to the system itself. Who's behind this? Vincent demanded. Who's using death row as a political tool? Blackstone smiled, blood staining his teeth. If I tell you that, you'll wish I'd let them execute you 3 days from now. Some truths are more dangerous than death, Vincent. And you're about to learn that the hard way. The scarred guard cut Blackstone's zip ties and hauled him to his feet. We need to move. Those people will be back, and next time they won't be interested in negotiations. But as they headed toward the warehouse exit, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with everything that had just happened. The timing was too convenient, the escape too easy, the threats too theatrical. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, and Vincent saw 3 vehicles waiting, 2 SUVs and a sedan. The scarred guard pointed to the sedan. That one's yours. Keys are in the ignition, $5,000 cash in the glove box, and a burner phone with 1 number programmed. In 48 hours, if you're still alive, call that number. We'll tell you what happens next. And if I'm not alive, then this whole thing was for nothing. And 17 years of your life were wasted on a conspiracy you'll never fully understand. Vincent climbed into the sedan, the envelope on the passenger seat, his mind already racing through options, analyzing escape routes, calculating odds. He'd spent 17 years in a concrete cell, and now he had 48 hours of freedom before someone decided whether he lived or died. He started the engine and pulled out of the warehouse district, heading toward a city he barely recognized after nearly 2 decades away. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the horizon in shades of orange and red that looked almost like fire. And as Vincent drove through empty streets, checking his mirrors for signs of pursuit, he finally opened the envelope fully and began reading the complete contents. What he found made his hands tremble on the steering wheel, made his breath catch in his throat, made him understand why so many people were willing to kill to keep these secrets buried. Because the pattern he'd identified wasn't about political manipulation or criminal conspiracies or judicial corruption. It was about something far worse. Something that meant the 12 death row inmates scheduled for transfer in the next 6 months weren't being murdered to silence them. They were being murdered to make room for someone else. Someone who wasn't supposed to be on death row at all. Someone whose execution had been planned from the moment they'd been arrested, tried, and convicted in a system designed not for justice, but for elimination. And that someone's transfer date was exactly 48 hours away. Vincent pulled over, his hands shaking, and reached for the burner phone. He didn't have 48 hours to disappear. He had 48 hours to stop an execution that would complete a conspiracy 17 years in the making. The question was whether anyone would believe a death row escapee who claimed that the entire Texas criminal justice system had been weaponized for a single, specific murder, and whether Vincent could expose the truth before the people who'd spent 17 years silencing him finally succeeded in making him disappear forever. Vincent sat in that sedan for exactly 3 minutes, watching the sun climb higher, painting the Houston skyline in harsh morning light that felt like an interrogation. His mind processed information the way it had in courtrooms, building cases piece by piece, connecting evidence into narratives that juries could understand. But this case wasn't meant for juries. This case was meant to stay buried forever. The name in the envelope, the one scheduled for transfer in 48 hours, belonged to someone Vincent had never heard of during his 17 years on death row. Daniel Morrison, convicted 8 months ago for the murder of a state senator's daughter. Quick trial, overwhelming evidence. Death sentence handed down with unusual speed for a case that normally would have taken years to reach that stage. But it was the other documents that made Vincent's blood run cold. Financial records showing Morrison had been a forensic accountant working for the Texas State Comptroller's office. Email threads, heavily redacted but still revealing, showing Morrison had discovered irregularities in state prison budgets. Expenditures that didn't match inmate counts, transfers of funds to shell companies, a systematic looting of taxpayer money that ran into hundreds of millions of dollars over 2 decades. Morrison hadn't killed anyone. Morrison had been silenced because he discovered that the Texas prison system wasn't just corrupt. It was a money laundering operation so massive and so deeply embedded in state government that exposing it would topple administrations, destroy political careers, and potentially reveal connections to organized crime that reached into every level of Texas power. And the death row transfer murders weren't about silencing witnesses. They were about making the system run smoothly, eliminating anyone who might investigate too deeply, ask too many questions, or survive long enough to piece together what Vincent now held in his hands. Vincent started driving again, this time with purpose. The burner phone had one program number, but he wasn't ready to use it yet. First, he needed to understand exactly who he could trust in a system where judges, guards, and entire institutions had been compromised. He drove to a location he'd memorized 17 years ago, back when he was still a prosecutor with a future. A small law office in a strip mall on the edge of Houston, run by a woman named Margaret. She'd been his mentor once, the prosecutor who taught him that justice wasn't about winning cases. It was about finding truth even when truth was uncomfortable. Margaret was 70 now, semi-retired, taking only cases that interested her. When Vincent walked through her office door at 7:30 that morning, still wearing prison transport clothes, carrying an envelope that contained enough evidence to destroy careers, she didn't scream or call the police. She just looked at him with those sharp eyes that had seen through 30 years of lies in courtrooms and said, "Vincent Castellano, I always knew you'd either die in prison or prove me right about your innocence. Looks like it's the latter." "I don't have much time," Vincent said, closing the door behind him. "And what I'm about to tell you will make you wish you'd never met me." "Too late for that. Sit down and talk fast." Vincent laid out everything. The death row murders, Judge Blackstone's involvement, the mysterious organization that had interrupted the warehouse meeting, and most importantly, Daniel Morrison's scheduled transfer in 46 hours. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to horror to something harder and more determined. "You're telling me the state has been executing people to cover up embezzlement," she said when he finished. "Not embezzlement. Infrastructure. They've been using prison construction budgets, inmate transfer costs, facility maintenance funds, all of it to build a parallel financial system. The money gets funneled through shell companies, laundered through legitimate businesses, and ends up funding operations that have nothing to do with corrections." Morrison discovered the pattern because he was auditing expenditures that didn't match inmate populations. He found prisons that supposedly housed thousands of inmates, but had utility bills for maybe hundreds. Transfer costs for inmates who didn't exist. Medical expenditures for facilities that weren't operational. Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the strip mall parking lot like it might contain answers. If what you're saying is true, this goes beyond criminal conspiracy. This is institutional corruption at a level I've never seen. And stopping Morrison's execution won't fix it. They'll just find another way. I'm not trying to fix the system, Vincent said quietly. I'm trying to save one life. Morrison's. Because if he dies, the evidence dies with him. His files, his research, everything he discovered. It's all locked in legal proceedings that will be sealed the moment his execution is carried out. No appeals, no reviews, no chance for anyone to verify what he found. It becomes case closed, file buried, conspiracy protected for another generation. What do you need from me? A phone call. One phone call to someone with enough power to delay Morrison's transfer long enough for federal investigators to review this evidence. Margaret turned back to face him, and Vincent saw the weight of 3 decades in law settling on her shoulders. Vincent, everyone with that kind of power is potentially compromised. If this conspiracy is as big as you say, there's no way to know who's clean and who's dirty. Make the wrong phone call, and Morrison dies faster, you disappear, and I probably join you. Then we don't call the system, Vincent said, pulling out the burner phone. We call the media. Full exposure. Everything in this envelope released to every major news network simultaneously. No time for damage control, no chance to bury the story. Force it into the light, so bright they can't make it disappear. They'll call you a death row escapee with a grudge. They'll say you fabricated evidence, that you're a murderer trying to create reasonable doubt about your own conviction. They'll destroy your credibility before the first story even airs. Vincent smiled, but there was no humor in it. Probably. But I was a prosecutor for 8 years before I went to prison. I know how to build a case that can't be dismissed. This envelope contains original documents, financial records with authentication markers, communication logs with metadata proving they weren't fabricated. It's enough to force an investigation, even if they tear my reputation apart in the process. Margaret crossed to her desk and opened a drawer. Inside was an old digital recorder, the kind journalists used before smartphones made everything obsolete. Then we make it airtight. You record everything you just told me. Detail your investigation, explain the pattern, walk through the evidence step by step. I'll corroborate your prosecutorial credentials, confirm that the man I knew would never fabricate evidence. And we send it all out simultaneously, enveloped to federal investigators, recording to media, copies to civil rights organizations and watchdog groups. Flood the zone before they can plug the leaks. For the next 4 hours, Vincent talked. He detailed 17 years of observation, patterns he'd noticed in death row transfers, conversations with guards who'd seemed troubled by procedures they couldn't quite articulate, the slow accumulation of evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with how Texas administered capital punishment. Margaret recorded every word, occasionally asking questions that sharpened the narrative, made it more compelling, more difficult to dismiss. By noon, they had a prosecution package that would have made Vincent proud back when he was on the right side of courtrooms. It wouldn't save his reputation or his freedom, but it might save Daniel Morrison's life. And it might force the kind of institutional review that could prevent future murders. Margaret made the first call while Vincent monitored the burner phone, waiting for whatever communication might come from the scarred guard's people. The media response was immediate and hungry. A death row escapee with prosecutorial credentials claiming systematic murder within the correction system? That was front-page material, lead story content, the kind of scandal that won journalism awards and destroyed political careers. By 2 p.m., the story was spreading across news networks. Vincent watched on Margaret's small office television as talking heads debated whether his claims had merit, whether the evidence was authentic, whether this was the biggest criminal justice scandal in Texas history or an elaborate hoax by a convicted murderer. And then, at 2:45, the burner phone rang. Vincent answered, putting it on speaker so Margaret could hear. The scarred guard's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Castellano, what the hell did you do?" Every news network in the country is running your story. Federal investigators just announced they're opening a probe into Texas death row procedures. And Judge Blackstone was found dead in his home an hour ago. Apparent suicide. Single gunshot to the head. Vincent felt his stomach drop. He didn't kill himself. Of course he didn't. They eliminated their loose end. And now they're cleaning house. 3 guards who worked death row transfers were killed in what's being called a gas leak at an apartment complex. 2 more are missing. The people behind this are erasing everyone who knew too much, and that includes you. What about Morrison? What about his transfer? Delayed pending investigation. You saved his life, Castellano. But you painted a target on your own back so big that every operator in the country is probably looking for you right now. Where are you? Vincent looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. They'd known this moment was coming. Somewhere safe. For now. It won't stay safe long. Listen to me very carefully. The organization I work for, the people who orchestrated your escape from that transfer van, we're not the good guys. We're just less bad than the people we're fighting. We wanted to control the information flow, use Blackstone's corruption as leverage to dismantle our rivals. But you've blown everything wide open, forced a public reckoning none of us wanted. Good. No, not good. Because now nobody wins. The corruption gets exposed, careers get destroyed, and the power vacuum that creates will be filled by people worse than Blackstone ever was. You've started a war, Castellano. And wars in the shadows don't end with justice. They end with bodies. The line went dead. Vincent set down the phone and looked at Margaret, who'd gone pale during the conversation. He's right, she said quietly. You've exposed the conspiracy, but you haven't fixed the system. You've just forced it to adapt, evolve, find new ways to hide. Maybe, Vincent said. Or maybe I've given people like Morrison a chance to survive long enough to keep fighting. Maybe that's all anyone can do. Buy time, force transparency, make the corruption work harder to stay hidden. Margaret's office television suddenly switched to breaking news. A reporter stood outside the Polunsky unit. Camera crews surrounding the facility's entrance. We're getting word that federal investigators have arrived at Texas's death row facility to begin what's being called the most comprehensive review of capital punishment procedures in the state's history. Sources tell us that as many as 40 current death row cases may be subject to review, with particular focus on transfer procedures and medical examiner reports for inmates who died before execution. Vincent watched the screen, feeling something shift in his chest. Not vindication, exactly. Not victory. But maybe something close to purpose. He'd spent 17 years in a concrete cell. 17 years believing his life had been stolen by a corrupt system. And maybe it had been. But in stealing his life, they'd inadvertently created someone uniquely positioned to see what everyone else missed. Someone with the time, the motivation, and the skill to build a case against the entire institution. The television switched to an interview with Daniel Morrison's defense attorney, a young woman who looked exhausted but determined. My client has maintained his innocence since day one. The evidence against him was always suspicious, too perfect, too convenient, too neatly packaged. Now we know why. Someone needed him silenced before his financial investigation could go public. This isn't just about Daniel Morrison. This is about every person on death row who might be there for reasons that have nothing to do with justice. Margaret turned off the television. What are you going to do now, Vincent? You're still technically an escaped death row inmate. Federal review might exonerate you eventually, but until then, you're a fugitive. And after what that guard said, you've got multiple organizations hunting you. Vincent stood, walked to the window, looked out at the ordinary world of strip malls and parking lots, people going about their lives completely unaware of the machinery grinding beneath the surface of their institutions. I'm going to do what I've been doing for 17 years. I'm going to investigate. Because Morrison's case isn't the only one. That envelope contained hints of other irregularities, other cases that don't quite add up. And if there are more innocent people on death row, more people being murdered by a system that's supposed to represent justice, then I'm going to find them. You can't do that alone. I won't be alone. Vincent pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he'd memorized during his years in prison, a number belonging to an investigative journalist who'd written about his case years ago, who'd believed in his innocence when nobody else did. The call connected after 2 rings. "This is Rachel Martinez." "Ms. Martinez, this is Vincent Castellano. I believe we have a lot to talk about." Over the next 6 weeks, the scandal exploded across Texas and beyond. Federal investigators uncovered evidence of systematic corruption spanning 2 decades. Judge Blackstone's death was officially ruled a homicide, part of a criminal conspiracy to eliminate witnesses. 17 death row cases were overturned, with more under review. Daniel Morrison was released pending retrial, his financial evidence becoming the foundation for prosecutions that would ultimately reach into the governor's office. But Vincent Castellano never saw any of it. 2 days after releasing his evidence, he disappeared. Some said he'd been killed by the same organization that had eliminated Blackstone. Others claimed he'd gone into federal protection, trading testimony for immunity. A few believed he was still out there, investigating from the shadows, building cases against corruption that most people couldn't even see. Rachel Martinez published a series of articles about his investigation, work that would win her a Pulitzer Prize and force comprehensive criminal justice reform across multiple states. In her final piece, she included a statement that had been anonymously delivered to her office. It read, "Justice isn't about perfect systems or clean institutions. It's about individuals who refuse to stop fighting even when the entire weight of corruption presses down on them. I spent 17 years on death row for a murder I didn't commit. I could have become bitter, broken, defeated. Instead, I became what the system feared most, someone who understood how it worked and wouldn't stop until that understanding became public knowledge. They wanted me to disappear forever. Instead, I've made sure that the truth they tried to bury will never be silenced. To everyone still fighting from inside those concrete cells, your stories matter. Your investigations matter. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. Keep fighting. Someone is listening. Someone will expose what they find. And someday, the machinery of corruption will finally break under the weight of all the truth it tried to bury." The statement wasn't signed, but everyone knew who'd written it. 3 months later, another body was found. Another death row inmate, killed during a transfer, made to look natural. But this time, someone had left evidence at the scene. Financial records, communication logs, connections to politicians who'd thought themselves untouchable. The investigation that followed would eventually bring down a criminal network that had operated for 30 years, using the Texas prison system as cover for operations that included money laundering, political assassination, and systematic elimination of anyone who discovered the truth. And in a small apartment in a city that Vincent Castellano would never name, a man who'd spent 17 years on death row sat at a desk surrounded by documents, building cases against corruption that most people would never know existed. He'd become a ghost in the system he'd once served, invisible and unstoppable, dedicated to a justice that didn't depend on courts or badges or institutions. Because he'd learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to become what it fears most. Not a criminal, not a vigilante, but someone who understands exactly how the machinery works and refuses to stop exposing its darkest secrets. The legend of Vincent the Prophet Castellano would grow over the years. Some would call him a hero. Others would label him a dangerous fugitive who manipulated public opinion to escape justice. But to the inmates still trapped in concrete cells, still fighting for exoneration, still refusing to let corruption win, he became something more important than either label. He became proof that even in the darkest institutions, even in systems designed to make people disappear forever, one person who refuses to stop fighting can change everything. And that truth was more dangerous than any prison, any conspiracy, or any organization that tried to bury it. If this story left you shaken, if it made you question what really happens inside America's deadliest prison system, then you're starting to understand. Because the machinery of injustice operates in shadows, counting on people to look away, to accept official narratives, to believe that systems designed for justice can't possibly be tools of oppression. But now you know better. And knowing is where justice begins.